Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping right in today because the subject is just that urgent. It's a story that has sent a genuine tremor through the entire foundation of the post-World War II international order.
It really has.
So the date is January 3rd, 2026. And the news breaks with this stunning speed. U.S. military forces have executed an overt boots-on-the-ground raid in Venezuela.
Right in the capital.
They've captured the sitting president, Nicolás Maduro, and the First Lady, Celia Flores. And almost immediately, they're transferred to New York to face a slate of international charges primarily centered around drug trafficking.
And it was a shocking use of explicit military force against a sovereign nation. But, if you were following 2 decades of relentless pressure leading up to this moment, you might see this event not as some kind of freak occurrence.
Not at all.
No, it feels more like the grim logical endpoint of a very long trajectory. I mean, the raid was really the dam finally breaking on a long-standing policy of regime change.
And that is precisely our mission for this deep dive. We are taking this event, this, dramatic legal and geopolitical flashpoint, and we're using the searing, incredibly detailed critique from renowned economist and UN advisor Jeffrey Sachs to understand its true gravity.
A really powerful voice on this.
Absolutely, because Sachs didn't frame this as just another news story. He framed it as a profound and potentially fatal crisis for international law itself.
His briefing to the UN Security Council, which was just 2 days later on January 5th, 2026, really became the centerpiece of this whole international crisis. And he made it very clear. He wasn't there to defend the accused leader.
No, this wasn't about Maduro's character.
Not at all. He was there, in his words, to defend the UN Charter. So our sources today, they pulled directly from that powerful indictment of the operation and allows us to explore 3 massive interconnected themes.
Okay, what are they?
So first, the immediate illegality of using overt force like this. Second, the long, continuous pattern of regime change operations. And we have to look at both the U.S. and the former Soviet Union here to be thorough.
A necessary counterpoint.
And third, the terrifying implications this all has for global sovereignty, especially, in a nuclear age.
We've assembled a source stack that is just dense with history and some very hard numbers. This is not abstract theory. We are going to unpack the specific mechanisms used in this kind of systematic statecraft.
We really need to get into the weeds on that.
We do, from the covert destabilization to the devastating power of sanctions. And we want you, the listener, to hear about the $7 billion in Venezuelan sovereign assets that were frozen way back in 2019.
A critical moment.
And the truly staggering data that political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke compiled, documenting 70 attempted U.S. coups during the Cold War alone.
It's an incredible number when you actually see it.
And maybe most chillingly, we are going to revisit what you could call the original sin of covert intervention, the deep, dark history of Operation Ajax in Iran in 1953. Because its shadow, it still haunts global affairs to this day.
It absolutely does. And our goal for you, the learner, is to connect the specifics of this dramatic raid, the capture, the charges, to the massive, often unseen historical currents that really define how great powers interact with smaller ones.
Right. We have to move beyond just the breaking headlines.
We have to truly understand whether the world still operates by a system of, enforceable international law, or if we've all just quietly surrendered to the law of the jungle, where at the end of the day, unchecked power is the only thing that defines what's right.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking that strategic shockwave of January 3rd, 2026. The world literally woke up to this news. An active, overt military operation by one sovereign state, the U.S., against another, Venezuela.
And not just an operation, but one that resulted in the capture and rendition of its sitting head of state. Sachs, in his address, called it a seismic rupture.
Why that specific term? What makes it seismic?
Well, it's seismic because in the entire post-World War II era, states generally agreed, at least on paper, not to cross this really bright red line. An overt, unauthorized military assault against a sitting government for the sole purpose of removing that leader and trying them in a foreign court. That's a whole different ballgame.
So Sachs's argument is that this action moved well beyond the, let's say, established norms of covert interference or economic pressure.
Exactly. It directly violated the most fundamental tenet of the global system that was built out of the ashes of World War II.
And he didn't just call it a mistake or, an overreach. He went straight to the legal core of the issue in his Security Council address.
Right.
What was his central legal condemnation?
He was completely unequivocal.
Yeah.
He called the operation and this is a direct quote, gross violation of international law and the UN Charter.
So no ambiguity there.
None whatsoever. The entire foundation of the UN is this concept of state sovereignty and the rule of law. And Sachs just hammered on one specific article, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter.
Let's break that down for a second. What does Article 2.4 actually say?
The long and short of it is that it's the covenant prohibiting the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. I mean, it is the absolute bedrock. It's the core promise that members make to each other.
And when we look at the facts of the January 3rd raid, what were the specific legal justifications that were, according to Sachs, completely absent?
There were two crucial justifications missing, which, in his view, rendered the entire operation illegal from the start.
Okay, number one.
First, Venezuela posed no imminent military threat to the United States. None. This wasn't a case of preempting an attack. So that nullified any claim to self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter.
Right, the self-defense clause.
Exactly. And second, and this is just as vital, the raid had no Security Council authorization. Only the Security Council can authorize the use of force in this kind of context, unless it's self-defense.
So without those two pillars...
Without those two pillars of legal justification, Sachs declared the operation not merely controversial, but fundamentally unlawful under the very document that was designed to prevent aggressive wars in the first place.
That legal framing is so critical because it shifts the entire conversation. It moves it away from a debate about the morality of the Maduro regime
Yes.
and puts it squarely on the legality of the U.S. action.
Exactly. And that's his whole point. The integrity of the law is tested most severely when it's inconvenient, when you're dealing with a leader or a regime that is, widely condemned.
That's the real test.
That's the test. If the U.S. can just use force against a non-threatening state without UN approval to pursue what is essentially a criminal indictment, then Article 2.4 becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
It's just words on paper.
So Sachs's argument is that even if Maduro is guilty of every single charge leveled against him,
Even then, the process, the means, must respect the Charter. Otherwise, the Charter itself ceases to exist as a meaningful constraint on power.
what's fascinating, and something I think we'd really have to impress upon you, the listener, is that Sachs insisted this wasn't some isolated act of, impulsive aggression. He argued it was the logical endpoint of a long trajectory.
That phrase, logical endpoint, is just vital to his whole argument. It forces us to view the raid not as an event in a vacuum, but as the final violent culmination of what was, in reality, a continuous 24-year pressure campaign.
24 years.
It's a long time. Sachs documented this as a rolling siege that really dates all the way back to the attempted coup in 2002.
So this trajectory, it involved all these continuous actions.
Yes, a whole playbook. Funding opposition groups, instigating political unrest, and then, that really dramatic step of recognizing parallel governments like they did with Juan Guaido in 2019.
Right.
And, of course, the implementation of sweeping, economy-destroying economic sanctions. All of these were steps on the same path.
So the calculus in Washington, it seems, was that each step would hollow out Venezuela's political institutions, inflict the sort of cumulative economic harm on its citizens.
And condition the global environment.
Right, until military force just became the next predictable step up the ladder of coercion.
That is the pattern. It's a classic escalation ladder. When sanctions and political isolation fail to produce the desired regime collapse, the powerful state is often tempted to move to direct force.
It's almost an admission of failure of the previous policies.
In a way, it is. Sachs believes this trajectory was predictable precisely because the goal regime change never changed. Only the mechanism evolved over time. The raid was simply the point where the policy transitioned from economic and covert warfare to explicit military action.
This brings us to the most provocative term that Sachs used, the one that instantly caught the world's attention. He called the operation gangsterism in U.S. foreign policy.
That's such a loaded term.
It is. So why did he use a word that has such, domestic criminal connotations? Why not just call it aggression or unilateralism?
Well, the bluntness was clearly a rhetorical strategy, but it was designed to define the governing logic behind the action. In gangster logic, Law isn't just violated, it's completely secondary. It's irrelevant.
Power is the only thing that matters.
Power replaces legal authority. Might defines what is right. And the control of territory, or in this case resources, absolutely trumps any notion of national legitimacy or established sovereignty.
So by using gangsterism, Sachs was suggesting that the U.S. had actively chosen to operate outside the agreed-upon legal framework of nations.
Yes, that it was essentially behaving like an organized criminal syndicate that operates outside of domestic law. It's a profound accusation.
And that term, it forces a discussion about the true underlying motives, doesn't it? We can't ignore the geopolitical incentives that have been fueling this for years, the shadows that often lurk behind the stated humanitarian or anti-narcotics rhetoric.
Sachs was very clear on this point. Ignoring the underlying motives would be politically naive. I mean, let's be blunt. Venezuela sits atop vast oil reserves, some of the largest proven reserves on the entire planet.
The elephant in the room.
It's always the elephant in the room. There is a persistent geopolitical desire for strategic positioning in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly to secure access to those resources and, neutralize an adversary that has often aligned itself with non-Western powers like Russia and China.
So when these powerful economic incentives intersect with the use of force,
it makes it incredibly difficult for the global community to view the operation purely through the lens of international justice. The resource motive casts this unavoidable and very long shadow over the whole affair.
And the cost of this gangster logic, as Sachs warned, would be paid not by the architects of the policy in Washington, but by ordinary Venezuelans. He offered a very grim empirical prediction about the human toll.
His warning was just. It was based on painful recent history. He said the raid would usher in a period of violence and chaos, not stability or democratic transition.
And this isn't theoretical for him.
Not at all. It's rooted in the historical precedents of imposed regime change. He cited the aftermaths of Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. 3 very clear examples where the forced removal of a leader, however unpopular or corrupt they may have been, rarely results in the immediate emergence of a stable, peaceful, or democratic successor state.
Let's talk more about the mechanism of that chaos, because it's not just a matter of removing one leader and plugging in another. It's about destroying the state's capacity to govern itself.
That's precisely it. When you surgically remove the top layer of state authority by force, even if that authority is tyrannical, you inevitably create a massive, deep power vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum.
So what rushes in to fill it?
Well, this vacuum invites immediate and violent competition. It causes the sudden rise of militias, it fragments the military into competing factions, and it deepens the existing economic shocks. It transforms what was already a dire humanitarian crisis into an absolute catastrophe.
And the ordinary citizen is caught in the middle.
The ordinary citizen, who is already struggling under years of sanctions, becomes the ultimate collateral damage. Sachs was explicit about this. The suffering is not an unforeseen side effect. It is the foreseeable and predictable outcome of policies that persistently favor violent coercion over patient multilateral diplomacy. It is a tragedy rooted in a predictable and preventable instability.
Okay, so if the 2026 raid was, as Sachs calls it, the logical endpoint, we have to meticulously trace that line of coercion back to its beginning. This is where the idea of the systematic campaign becomes so critical. It demonstrates that regime change has been the policy goal since the early 2000s.
Understanding the continuity of this pressure campaign is absolutely essential because it completely dismantles the argument that the 2026 raid was some kind of sudden, necessary emergency response to criminal activity.
It wasn't an improvisation.
No. Sachs argued that the policy has been focused on regime change systematically, methodically since the start of the century.
So let's start with that first clear signal, which was set way back in April 2002.
The attempted coup against the government in April 2002 was foundational. It set the tone for everything that followed. Our source material notes that the United States had prior knowledge of and effectively approved that attempt.
So complicity from the very beginning.
It established the pattern, active involvement in the overthrow of the sitting government. The U.S. supported the brief installation of Pedro Carmona Estaga, and while that too quickly reversed, the intention was laid bare for the world to see. It really set the stage for 2 decades of friction.
And as we move into the 2010s, the tactics seem to shift away from that overt coup support towards more of an internal destabilization, mainly through financial support.
That's a key step in the systematic playbook. U.S. government funding through various agencies and NGOs began flowing directly to civil society groups, opposition movements, and organizations that were actively involved in anti-government protests.
This is one of those corrosive tools that Sachs mentioned.
Exactly. The instigation of unrest and supporting opposition to undermine internal stability. And of course, when Caracas responded to these protests with crackdowns, the response from Washington wasn't de-escalation or negotiation.
It was immediate escalation.
Immediate escalation via sanctions. Every action was met with a disproportionate reaction that tightened the economic screws.
We see that escalation formalized in 2015 under President Barack Obama. This was an action that many observers might overlook, but it was actually a massive shift in the legal standing of the conflict.
It was a crucial legal maneuver. In 2015, President Obama formally declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States.
And that language is very specific, right? It's not just rhetoric.
Not at all. It is the necessary legal prerequisite under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, to impose the broadest, most expansive unilateral sanctions. It fundamentally reframed Venezuela from being, a difficult, poorly governed neighbor into a formally recognized threat to the U.S. homeland. It was the legal green light for everything that came next.
Then the rhetoric just continues to climb. By 2017, President Donald Trump was openly contemplating the ultimate military solution.
Yeah, this was really a stunning moment. In 2017, at a dinner with Latin American leaders during the UN General Assembly, President Trump openly discussed the possibility of a U.S. invasion to overthrow the government.
So the quiet part was said out loud.
The quiet part was said out loud on the record. And this public comment just cemented the ultimate goal regime change by any means necessary long before 2026. The world was officially put on notice that military options were not just a last resort, they were actively on the table.
Okay, now let's focus heavily on the economic strangulation. The sort of slow violence of sanctions, which Sachs argued are themselves illegal under international law. Why? Why are these sanctions, specifically the unilateral, comprehensive ones, prohibited by the UN Charter?
This is a really important point of technical distinction. Under international law, particularly the UN Charter, only one body has the authority to impose coercive measures, meaning actions intended to force a state to change its policy or behavior.
And that's the UN Security Council.
That's the UN Security Council. And those measures are generally reserved for clear threats to international peace and security. So Sachs argues that when the U.S. or any other state imposes sweeping, economy-destroying sanctions unilaterally, they are usurping the authority of the Security Council.
So they're acting as judge, jury, and executioner?
In a way, yes. And they're violating the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of another state, which is another core tenet of the Charter.
So just to be clear, if the sanctions were, say, targeted at specific human rights abusers or individual government officials, like a Magnitsky Act sanction, those might be legally defensible.
Precisely. Targeted sanctions against named individuals, freezing their personal assets abroad, are generally accepted as a legitimate tool of state action. But the Venezuelan sanctions were something else entirely. They were sweeping and sectoral.
Meaning they targeted entire industries.
They targeted the nation's entire primary industry, oil. And this moves the goalposts from punishing bad actors to punishing the entire populace. It's essentially using economic starvation as a tool of political coercion, which is internationally condemned.
Let's give the listener the catastrophic numbers, because this is where the policy really translates into tangible human suffering.
The core of the economic attack was on PDVSA, the state oil company. The sweeping sanctions imposed between 2017 and 2020 directly contributed to a collapse of oil production by a staggering 75%.
75%.
It's almost unbelievable. Oil production fell from over 2 million barrels a day to barely 500,000. For Venezuela, which is a petrostate where oil accounts for something like 90% of its export revenue, this was akin to cutting off the national oxygen supply.
And what did that collapse mean for the average Venezuelan citizen on the street?
The cumulative economic devastation was it was a complete catastrophe. It resulted in the real GDP per capita collapsing by a devastating 62%.
Wow.
I mean, to put that in perspective for you, this is a collapse on the scale of the worst historical disasters, like total wartime destruction. And Sachs highlighted that this collapse directly fueled the humanitarian crisis, the breakdown of the healthcare system, the lack of crucial imported medicines, the food shortages, and of course the massive migration crisis, which forced millions of Venezuelans to flee their homes.
So the policy intentionally weaponized economic suffering.
It did, with the hope of turning the population against the regime. That was the explicit strategy.
And that weaponization, it really reached its financial peak in early 2019 with what you called the Juan Guaido gambit.
Yes. The U.S. unilaterally recognizing Juan Guaido as the interim president on January 23, 2019, was immediately followed by a direct financial assault. It was the legal pretext they needed.
For what?
For the freezing of roughly $7 billion in Venezuelan sovereign assets that were held in U.S. and European banks. And we have to be clear, this was not Maduro's personal fortune. These were the nation's funds, its savings, its capacity to conduct international trade, all legally blocked and handed over, or at least nominally controlled, by a recognized parallel government that had no real power on the ground.
Sachs views this asset seizure as a critical crossing point, doesn't he? A transition from general economic pressure into an act that is almost as severe as a direct military intervention, just conducted through financial means.
It's the financial amputation of a state.
Mm.
And when you look at the 2026 raid, you see it wasn't a sudden action at all. It was simply the moment the regime change project finally crossed the line from financial and covert warfare into explicit, overwhelming military action after 2 decades of continuous escalating pressure.
And that very escalation, Sachs argued, is pushing the entire world toward an era of legal chaos, that the UN Security Council is at a crossroads.
It is. The question he posed to them is elemental. Will the UN Charter remain a living, binding document that actually restrains the powerful, or will it be selectively ignored whenever it's deemed politically inconvenient?
And his warning was that the collapse wouldn't be dramatic.
Exactly. His most sobering warning was that the rules-based international order wouldn't necessarily collapse with some spectacular confrontation, but rather with a shrug, a slow, creeping normalization of the use of force and economic coercion without any legal authority.
A normalization of anarchy.
Exactly. He warned that this slow erosion, this moving away from principle back to pure dominance, risks turning international law into a dead letter. Because if the most powerful nation can operate outside the law, it invites every other nation to do the same. And that ultimately threatens the very structure that was designed to prevent global catastrophe.
So we've established that Venezuela is the endpoint of a specific 2-decade-long policy trajectory. Now, let's pull the camera back even further, because Sachs argues that this is not an outlier at all, but rather proof that intervention is a systemic pathology of great power politics. This is where the historical data truly becomes staggering.
It's crucial to understand this. Systematic regime change is a form of statecraft that has been refined and deployed for over a century. Sachs cited the work of political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke, who meticulously documented 70 attempted U.S. regime change operations between 1947 and 1989 alone.
70 attempts in just 42 years.
70 attempts in 42 years. The number itself is just staggering. It tells you something profound about the period.
When we hear that number, 70, it means that intervention wasn't some rare or reluctant decision made in a crisis. It was a near-constant occupational hazard for leaders all across the globe.
It really was.
Can we break down those 70 attempts? What were the types of coups being attempted during the Cold War?
O'Rourke's research shows a whole variety of methods were deployed, depending on the target and the circumstances. This included direct military invasions, like we saw in the Dominican Republic in 1965.
Okay, so overt force.
Overt force. But more commonly, it was supporting military coups through intelligence sharing, funding, and arms. The classic example there, of course, is Chile in 1973.
The overthrow of Allende.
Precisely. And they even documented what they termed covert parliamentary coups, which is fascinating. This is where financial and political pressure was used to force the resignation of leaders who had fallen out of favor, all without a single shot being fired. The sheer volume shows a vast, systematic effort to shape the political map of the world.
And if we look specifically at the traditional U.S. sphere of influence, Latin America, the frequency is even more pronounced. It really confirms that pattern of conditional sovereignty close to home.
Indeed. The numbers there are even more stark. Between 1898 and 1994, the U.S. successfully intervened to change governments at least 41 times in Latin America alone. 41 successful interventions. That averages out to roughly 1 successful regime change every 28 months for almost an entire century. This just demonstrates a continuous policy that ensures national sovereignty in the Western Hemisphere remains perpetually conditional upon U.S. economic and political approval.
And the more subtle, non-military forms of coercion were just as pervasive, right?
Absolutely. The data on electoral interference is equally compelling. We have documentation of U.S. interventions in foreign elections, totaling at least 81 between 1946 and 2000.
81 elections.
And these interventions range from covert funding of preferred political parties to sophisticated media manipulation, propaganda campaigns, and even direct campaigning efforts by U.S. officials. Election manipulation allows the powerful state to achieve its favorable outcomes without the political or military cost of a full-blown invasion.
So Sachs detailed this whole playbook of corrosive tools used in this systematic statecraft. The playbook that, as we've discussed, almost always results in institutional collapse instead of stability. Let's try to make these tools a bit more tangible with some quick examples.
Okay, the playbook is comprehensive. It's been honed over decades. First, you have open warfare or covert intelligence operations. Think of the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in 1961, or the extensive CIA operations that led to the coup in Guatemala in 1954.
Okay, that's the direct approach.
Then you have the instigation of unrest. This is the continuous years-long funding of anti-government groups in places like Ukraine during the Orange Revolution or, as we just discussed at length, in Venezuela.
Then there's backing armed groups.
Support for armed groups, exactly. Yeah. Arming and training proxy forces, which was famously seen in Central America during the Contra Wars in Nicaragua in the 1980s.
And media manipulation has to be a big one.
A huge one. Media manipulation and propaganda. This was absolutely essential in Operation Ajax, which we're going to detail soon. Spreading fake news and rumors to discredit leaders and turn the population against them.
And what about just, old-fashioned bribery?
Always a factor. Bribery of officials is key. You undermine stability from within by paying key military and political figures to switch their allegiance or to defect at a critical moment. Then you have the darker tools, like targeted assassinations and false flag operations. Though these often remain deep in the shadows, they're used to eliminate opposition leaders or to create a pretext for a larger intervention.
And finally, the tool of our era.
Economic warfare through sanctions. The slow, systemic destruction of a state's capacity to function. As deployed against Venezuela and historically against places like Cuba and Iran for decades, it's a modern siege.
It's important to note that before the Cold War provided this convenient anti-communist justification for everything, the motivations were much clearer, much more nakedly economic. Let's look at what the sources call the empire before empire period, the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
This is critical because it shows the initial unvarnished motives. Take Hawaii in 1893. U.S. forces actively supported the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. The driving force was purely economic. American sugar planters needed protection for their highly profitable interests and ultimately a path to annexation to avoid U.S. tariffs. It was business, plain and simple.
And then there's the geopolitical masterpiece, the creation of Panama in 1903.
An act of pure strategic regime change. The U.S. backed Panama's secession from Colombia for one reason and one reason only. Colombia refused to grant favorable terms to the canal construction.
So they just created a new country that would.
They created a new, pliable state, carved it out of Colombia, to secure the construction and permanent U.S. control of the Panama Canal. As the sources note, this was geopolitics poured in concrete. It was a strategic asset secured through engineered political instability.
And then there are the infamous banana wars. I mean, the name itself tells you everything you need to know about the corporate influence at play.
It really does. From the 1900s through the 1930s, U.S. Marines were repeatedly deployed in Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. The intervention was designed explicitly to install pro-American leaders, stabilize local politics in a way that favored U.S. interests, and most importantly, safeguard the massive holdings of U.S. fruit companies, especially the United Fruit Company.
So this established a firm precedent.
It established that sovereignty for smaller nations was always secondary to American commercial and strategic imperatives in its own backyard.
Now, let's fast forward into the modern era, post-Cold War. The goal of regime change continued, but the marketing, the branding, it changed. Intervention was rebranded.
The ideological justification shifted. It moved away from anti-communism and towards things like humanitarian intervention, democracy promotion, or the war on terror. But the institutional collapse that followed was often tragically consistent with the earlier failures.
A prime example being Iraq in 2003.
Absolutely. The invasion removed Saddam Hussein, yes, but in dismantling the entire existing state apparatus, the Ba'ath Party, the army, it unleashed a violent insurgency and a deep, bloody, sectarian war that continues to shape the region to this day. Disorder, not the promised democracy, was the ultimate outcome.
And the 2011 intervention in Libya is arguably an even clearer, more recent example of that same destabilizing outcome.
I would say so. The NATO intervention ousted Muammar Gaddafi, but the result was not a unified democratic state. Instead, it led directly to a fractured state ruled by competing militias and tribal factions, a hub for instability and arms trafficking across North Africa. The institutional collapse was comprehensive.
In Syria,
And our involvement in Syria since 2011, through support for various rebel factions, has only prolonged a devastating civil war. So, history teaches us this very consistent lesson. Power can be decisive in the short term. It can always remove a leader. But it is profoundly destabilizing in the long run. Legitimacy is local, and it cannot, as the sources note, be airlifted in from abroad.
we have to devote significant time to this, Operation Ajax,
Yeah.
because it just encapsulates the most destructive elements of this kind of statecraft. This 1953 coup in Iran was the moment a democratically elected government was explicitly crushed between the relentless pursuit of oil revenue and the rising paranoia of the early Cold War. It is, for all intents and purposes, the original template for modern covert regime change.
Operation Ajax, or Operation Boot, as the British called it, is the defining case study for Sachs's entire critique, because it showed, in no uncertain terms, that if a democratic outcome threatened Western economic interests, that democracy was deemed expendable.
And the immediate target was the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh.
A hugely popular figure at the time.
What was the core conflict? What made Mossadegh so intolerable to London and eventually to Washington?
It was pure economic nationalism.
Hmm.
Mossadegh, who was elected in 1951, had done something unforgivable in their eyes. He nationalized Iran's vast oil industry.
Which had been under foreign control for decades.
For decades. That oil had been exploited by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, which is the predecessor of modern-day BP, under terms that Iran, and most of the world, viewed as wildly unfair. So nationalization was immensely popular among Iranians. It was an act of national self-determination. But to the UK, it was an existential economic threat.
Britain was facing financial ruin after the war, but the U.S. under President Truman initially hesitated to support a coup against a democratic leader. What changed Washington's mind?
The Cold War paranoia was a catalyst. The shift from the Truman to the Eisenhower administration was key. Britain was focused on economic vengeance. The U.S., under President Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers, was terrified that the instability resulting from the oil crisis might push Iran, a key strategic state bordering the Soviet Union, into the Soviet sphere of influence.
So the fear of communism trumped the support for democracy.
It did. The conclusion they came to was fatal. A wrong democracy, one that dared to exercise its economic autonomy, was deemed more dangerous than the right autocrat, who in this case was the young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The objective became crystal clear: remove Mossadegh and restore the Shah to absolute power.
Okay, let's talk about the specific conspiracy details, the sheer cloak and dagger nature of Operation Ajax. Who was on the ground leading this operation, and what were the logistics?
Well, the operation was approved at the very highest levels. President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the U.S. and Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the U.K. both gave the final green light. But the planning and execution on the ground fell to the CIA, specifically to a man named Kermit Kim Roosevelt Jr.
Teddy Roosevelt's grandson.
Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, yes, operating under the alias James Lockwood. Roosevelt was the master manipulator on the ground in Tehran.
And the budget allocated for this was entirely for sowing chaos and corruption.
Exactly. The CIA allocated roughly $1 million, which is about $10 million in today's money, for the specific purpose of destabilization. And the tactics were just profoundly corrosive and systemic.
Let's list them.
First, bribery. Large sums of cash were paid to politicians, to military officers, and critically, to the commanders of organized street gangs and mobs in Tehran.
So they were buying an army.
They were buying a mob. Second, a very sophisticated propaganda and disinformation campaign. Money was spent to ensure local newspapers ran a coordinated stream of stories portraying Mossadegh as corrupt, as a communist sympathizer, and crucially, as being anti-Islamic. This was designed to turn the religious establishment and the traditionalist working class against him.
And they even staged violence.
Yes. This is one of the most cynical parts. Paid mobs were organized to pose as Mossadegh supporters, and then they would go out and attack mosques and conservative strongholds, thus alienating key segments of the populace from the man they were pretending to support. It was a classic false flag operation.
The timeline of the execution is just a remarkable story of defiance because the initial attempt actually failed, right?
It failed spectacularly. The plan was set in motion on August 13, 1953, when the Shah reluctantly signed the decrees dismissing Mossadegh. But the plot was porous. It had leaked. The first coup attempt between August 15th and 16th failed almost immediately. Conspirators were arrested, and Mossadegh remained firmly in power.
And the Shah panicked.
The Shah fled in panic, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. And critically, at this point, Washington ordered the operation halted. They were fearful of discovery of the diplomatic fallout. They told Roosevelt to get out of the country.
But Kim Roosevelt, the man on the ground, he ignored that direct order from headquarters. What gave him the confidence to defy Washington?
He was a true believer. He believed he was too close to success to stop. He had already spent his budget, his key assets were in motion, and he saw the momentary panic of the failure not as a defeat, but as an opportunity. He used the remaining funds to mobilize his paid mobs and military units for one final, desperate, decisive push on August 19, 1953.
And this time it worked.
This time it worked. These paid mobs, supported by military elements loyal to the Shah, stormed Mossadegh's residence. Violent clashes erupted in the streets, hundreds of people died, and by the end of the day, Mossadegh was in custody and his democratic government had collapsed.
So the immediate short-term outcome was clear. The CIA had achieved its goal. The Shah returned from his brief exile in Rome.
It was hailed inside the agency as a brilliant, cheap victory, a masterpiece of covert action. It was the CIA's first successful overthrow of a democratically elected foreign government. And the short-term economic goal was also achieved. The subsequent 1954 oil agreement nominally gave Iran a 50% share of profits, but in reality it transferred 40% of the oil consortium's control to U.S. firms, giving them a new major foothold in the Middle East.
But the long-term consequences, as we now know, proved to be catastrophic, and that's why the shadow of Ajax remains so long.
The long-term damage was profound and incalculable. The coup destroyed any possibility of a homegrown Iranian democracy. The Shah's subsequent 25 years of absolute Western-backed authoritarian rule, enforced by his brutal secret police, the Savak, bred this deep, lasting, and potent anti-American and anti-Western resentment among the Iranian people.
A resentment that finally exploded.
It exploded in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And that revolution was fueled, in large part, by the collective memory of 1953. The lesson is just tragic. Short-term geopolitical and economic gains, secured by crushing the legitimate popular will of a nation, will inevitably sow the seeds of long-term instability and violent blowback. Collective memory cannot be controlled with $1 million of propaganda. It has a life of its own.
So Sachs's indictment of great power politics demands that we apply the same unblinking scrutiny to all the major actors on the world stage. Having detailed the systematic use of regime change by the U.S., we absolutely have to shift the lens to the other great superpower of the Cold War, the Soviet Union.
It's a crucial counterpoint for our understanding of systemic statecraft. The USSR also pursued a pervasive policy of intervention and regime change, driven by their own unique set of motives. Their ideological engine was, of course, Marxist-Leninist doctrine.
The goal being global revolution.
The stated goal was global revolution and, more pragmatically, securing vital strategic buffer states on its vast periphery.
So their goals were ideological, but the methods, the use of force, coercion, and the complete disregard for sovereignty were pure, aggressive, realpolitik, correct?
Exactly. They framed their interventions as necessary defense against global capitalism or as fraternal assistance to their communist allies. But when you look at the actions, scholarly estimates suggest the USSR carried out somewhere between 30 and 40 major interventions during its existence.
And that includes direct military invasions.
It includes direct military invasions, extensive covert action, and the waging of proxy wars across 3 continents. The outcomes for the target nations often mirrored the very same crutching of autonomy that we saw in places like Iran.
Let's look at the early period, the immediate efforts following the Bolshevik Revolution to ignite that global fire.
In the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1922, the new Soviet state used overwhelming military force to ensure the incorporation of key territories like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus. They prevented their independent existence and consolidated the core of what would become the USSR.
But their attempts to spread the revolution further west into Europe were checked.
They were, most famously, in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919–1921. The Soviet push was decisively repelled at the Battle of Warsaw, a defeat that temporarily contained the westward spread of communism by force.
But they were successful in creating satellite states in Asia, which set a precedent for external control.
Yes. In Mongolia in 1921, the Soviets backed the formation of the Mongolian People's Party to successfully establish a satellite communist state, which remained firmly under Moscow's strategic control for decades. And later, in the mid-1930s, particularly in China's Xinjiang province, Soviet troops intervened directly to suppress local rebellions and maintain a favorable regional alignment.
And the methods could be brutal.
Incredibly so. Disturbingly, sources confirm that in some of these remote campaigns, Soviet forces even employed chemical weapons against local insurgents, demonstrating a willingness to use maximum force to maintain regional control.
And World War II, just as it did for the U.S., provided the opportunity for a massive expansion of influence under the cover of war.
The expansion was brutal and decisive. You have the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany, which secretly partitioned Eastern Europe. This saw the USSR annex eastern Poland.
And then the Baltic states.
This was followed by the forced integration of the Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1940. This was done through intimidation, staged elections, and mass deportations of local leaders, intellectuals, and anyone who might form a core of resistance.
And post-WWII, the Iron Curtain descends across Europe.
As the Red Army advanced towards Berlin, communist regimes were systematically installed across Eastern Europe, in Poland, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. This consolidation created the Eastern Bloc, securing the Soviet Union's vital strategic buffer against the West, but in the process it eliminated the national autonomy of dozens of millions of people for 2 generations.
But the USSR couldn't maintain control just through political coercion. They had to use massive, overwhelming force repeatedly to suppress any flicker of independence within that bloc. Let's detail the famous interventions of 1956 and 1968.
The willingness to use overwhelming military might against their supposed allies became the hallmark of Soviet imperial control. First, in Hungary in 1956. A popular uprising demanded democratic reforms and, crucially, withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact.
A direct challenge to Moscow.
A direct challenge. Moscow responded by deploying 31,000 troops and over 1,000 tanks to crush the revolution. They killed thousands and brutally installed a compliant Janos Kadar. This sent an unmistakable, bloody message to the entire bloc. Resistance meant destruction.
And the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968 delivered the exact same message, but perhaps with even broader geopolitical impact.
It was an even larger demonstration of military power. The reformist government of Alexander Dubček attempted to implement socialism with a human face, allowing greater freedom of expression and political liberalization.
A dangerous idea for Moscow.
Moscow viewed this as an existential threat to its strategic stability. The invasion involved a massive force of 250,000 Warsaw Pact troops. The invasion ended the reforms, restored hardline control, and crucially, it led to the articulation of what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Which was?
The Brezhnev Doctrine was the official Soviet policy asserting the right to intervene in any socialist state if socialism itself was threatened.
So that was a direct challenge to the very concept of sovereignty within the Soviet sphere. It sounds a lot like the conditional sovereignty we discussed in Latin America.
It's precisely the same concept with a different ideological wrapper. It declared that national sovereignty was subservient to the ideological needs of the Soviet bloc. The invasion of Czechoslovakia crushed hope for any kind of internal reform and deeply demoralized Western communist parties who had to watch their ideological motherland use tanks to destroy self-determination.
The Soviets, much like the U.S., also engaged heavily in global proxy wars, trying to extend their influence across Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
Yes, absolutely. They provided arms, training, and financial support to Marxist-aligned liberation movements and governments in places like Angola, Ethiopia, Egypt, and they famously backed the successful Sandinistas in Nicaragua in 1979. These proxy conflicts turned the developing world into a violent chessboard for superpower competition, resulting in immense internal instability across many states.
And their final self-destructive direct intervention was, of course, Afghanistan in 1979.
That was the ultimate overreach. The invasion of Afghanistan significantly accelerated the Soviet Union's own collapse. They deployed over 100,000 troops to shore up the struggling communist PDPA regime.
And it became their Vietnam.
It did. The decade-long conflict resulted in approximately 15,000 Soviet deaths, massive civilian casualties in Afghanistan, and it created a determined and, importantly, U.S.-backed insurgency. The war drained the Soviet economy, demoralized its military, and was a profound factor in the internal disillusionment that led to the USSR's eventual dissolution.
So, the cautionary tale from the Soviet experience is really the same as the US experience. Ambition and ideology can temporarily reshape maps, but they cannot indefinitely suppress the human desire for autonomy and freedom.
That is the tragic, enduring legacy of great power politics from this period. Both superpowers, regardless of their stated ideologies, whether it was anti-communism or Marxist-Leninism, used systematic coercion, intervention, and force to pursue their geopolitical interests. And the costs were always paid by the civilian populations of the target nations, resulting in instability that far outlasted the initial military or political objectives. Force creates a vacuum, and legitimacy, whether it's communist or democratic, simply cannot be imposed from the outside.
Okay, let's bring all of this complex and frankly dark history back to the immediate crisis in 2026. Nicolás Maduro is in New York, he's facing charges, but here is the massive paradox that really challenges Sachs's critique of pure sovereignty.
It's a huge challenge.
Maduro is accused of orchestrating the cartel of the suns, effectively running a narcotics network that is embedded deep within the state apparatus itself.
This creates a profound legal and moral conflict. It's not a simple case. Maduro is presented as this hybrid figure, a head of state who has allegedly merged state authority with the direction of a transnational criminal cartel. The sources liken him to notorious figures like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman.
So the fundamental question becomes this. If a leader truly turns his state into a criminal enterprise, using state resources for international crime, does that, in the eyes of the global community, automatically nullify his nation's protection under the principle of sovereignty?
That's the intellectual trap, isn't it? If the accusations are true, and we have to stress they are very serious accusations, doesn't that fundamentally change the legal calculus? Is the UN Charter really designed to provide a legal shield to alleged transnational kingpins?
It's the core conflict. What is Sachs's answer to that? Because it's a powerful counterargument.
It is. And his answer, which is rooted in a very strict adherence to the Charter, is that the ends, even if they are noble, like pursuing justice against a drug lord, do not justify the means if the means are illegal military aggression.
So the process matters more than the outcome.
The integrity of the process is paramount. He reiterated that he saw the raid as gangsterism precisely because he believed the strategic interest, the oil, the control of the Western Hemisphere, was the dominant motive, and it was just overriding the purported justice motive. For Sachs, allowing the raid to stand as a precedent destroys the foundation of global order.
Because if the military raid is allowed to stand without a definitive legal challenge from the international community, then sovereignty for any smaller, militarily weaker nation essentially vanishes. Protection becomes dependent entirely on military deterrence, not international law.
That's the chilling implication. Sovereignty has to be universal, or it's not a principle. It's just a privilege reserved for the powerful. If the U.S. can simply declare a foreign leader a criminal and use military force to kidnap them, then the entire structure built after 1945 is nullified. We're back in a world governed only by might.
So if unilateral military intervention, supported by a 2-decade campaign of economic strangulation, is the wrong answer, what is the policy prescription that's suggested in the sources for addressing the very real humanitarian and political crisis in Venezuela?
The preferred legal path is based on multilateral consensus. It's slower, it's messier, but it's legal. It requires empowering the domestic opposition, figures like Maria Corina Machado, through a process of transparent, internationally supervised elections.
And these elections must be mediated by neutral bodies.
Yes, by bodies like the UN or the Organization of American States, OAS, to guarantee a fair process for all sides. This allows Venezuelans to determine their own destiny, and it avoids the creation of that power vacuum we keep talking about.
It restores legitimacy through popular consent, not foreign imposition.
Exactly. The history of Iraq and Libya shows us that imposed regime change, even when you're removing a universally reviled tyrant, inevitably creates power vacuums, insurgencies, and humanitarian crises that can last for decades. The democratic alternative is the only sustainable path to stability.
Okay, let's pivot now to the ultimate test of these limits of sovereignty and alliances. A true future shock thought experiment based on the very principles that Sachs outlined. Let's discuss what the sources call the hypothetical Greenland gambit.
This thought experiment is crucial because it tests what happens when this gangster logic of violating sovereignty is applied not to a weak adversary like Venezuela, but to a treaty ally.
So the context. Greenland is a resource-rich territory with immense strategic value in the Arctic, and it is under Danish sovereignty. And critically, Denmark is a core NATO member. It hosts the vital Thule Air Base, a key Arctic defense and missile warning hub for the entire alliance.
And the more immediate context is former President Trump's 2019 proposal to purchase Greenland, which Denmark, a NATO ally, categorically dismissed as absurd at the time.
So let's extrapolate that scenario. Let's imagine a hypothetical forced annexation or a military seizure disguised as a security operation using the very same logic as the Venezuelan raid. What happens?
The consequences would be catastrophic, far, far beyond the tactical gain of the territory. While Article 5 of the NATO Treaty guarantees mutual defense, a unilateral act of aggression or a forced seizure of territory from a fellow member, regardless of the stated justification, would utterly shatter the trust and integrity of the NATO alliance.
So the alliance itself would break.
It would break. The fundamental premise of NATO collective defense would be exposed as conditional and disposable. It wouldn't be worth the paper it's written on.
A fracture of that magnitude would force Europe to fundamentally reassess its reliance on the U.S. for its own security.
Absolutely. European allies, Germany, France, the UK, who already maintain significant defense and economic integration, would interpret U.S. aggression against Denmark as the ultimate act of betrayal. And this would act as a powerful catalyst. It would massively accelerate the trend toward continental integration, potentially ushering in the birth of a United States of Europe.
And if that United States of Europe were catalyzed by U.S. aggression, what would its geopolitical role look like based on the analysis in these sources?
It would be a consolidation of European power designed explicitly to provide sovereign deterrence and security independent of the U.S. It would involve the rapid establishment of a common European defense force, the complete coordination of foreign policy, and the enforcement of shared economic frameworks to rival the dollar.
A new superpower.
A new superpower, born out of necessity. Such a unified, powerful entity would be capable of rivaling both the U.S. and China on the global stage, fundamentally reshaping the dynamics of global trade, security, and the future balance of power. The erosion of law in Venezuela, paradoxically, could lead to the forging of a new, powerful legal economic bloc in Europe.
So whether we look at the historical data, the systematic use of sanctions against Venezuela, or this hypothetical Greenland gambit, Sachs's core argument remains the same. The raid is a mirror held up to the entire global order.
It is. The choice presented to the world is simple but stark. It's law or its force, its principle or its dominance. Sachs was emphatic that pursuing justice against leaders like Maduro must be done through legal, multilateral channels to preserve the principle of sovereignty for everyone.
Because in a nuclear-armed world,
In a nuclear-armed world where a single miscalculation can lead to global catastrophe, failure to adhere to the UN Charter is final. There is no third chance for the global system after the failures of the League of Nations and the horrors of the two world wars.
so the stakes are not just about Venezuela. They are about the ultimate survival of the system that was designed to prevent the collapse of civilization.
Exactly. The failure of the strong to uphold the law is an open invitation for anarchy by all the other powerful actors.
Yeah.
And that instability is the single greatest danger to the future of the global order.
Hashtag, tag, outro.
We've concluded a really extensive deep dive into the history, the law, and the power dynamics behind this Venezuelan crisis. Let's try to review the essential takeaways we've gathered today for you, the learner.
Okay. First, the 2026 raid was not an impulse. It was the endpoint of a decades-long systematic policy of coercion, sanctions, and destabilization that began all the way back in 2002. It was the crossing of a threshold from covert economic warfare to explicit military force, the final stage in a predetermined regime change project. Second, and this is so important, regime change is not an anomaly. It is a consistent, nonpartisan tool of statecraft used by great powers for over a century. Whether you look at the 70 attempted U.S. coups in the Cold War, the hundreds of electoral interventions, or the Soviet invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the result is the same. The crushing of sovereignty and the sowing of long-term instability for short-term strategic gain. And we saw the ultimate example of that in the lasting trauma of Operation Ajax in Iran.
Third, and perhaps most critically for right now, the legitimacy of the international order hinges entirely on whether the UN Charter binds the strong as well as the weak. When the powerful ignore the charter by using illegal military force or devastating unilateral sanctions, they replace law with gangsterism.
Okay.
They erode the very structure designed to prevent global conflict, and they create dangerous precedents that threaten even their own alliances, as we demonstrated with the hypothetical fracture of NATO.
The tragic lesson, which we've seen repeated in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan, is that states are easy to topple and immensely difficult to rebuild. Power is decisive in the short term, but it is profoundly destabilizing in the long run. Legitimacy is the one ingredient that defines sustainable peace, and it cannot be manufactured or purchased from the outside.
And this leaves us with our final provocative thought. The ultimate dilemma as the trial of the captured leader unfolds in New York. The world is rightfully focused on the ends justice against a leader accused of directing a vast criminal cartel. But if the international community fails to legally and decisively challenge the means of his capture, the illegal military raid on a sovereign nation, what principle of universal sovereignty remains to protect any state that lacks sufficient military deterrence? If the law only protects the powerful, can we truly claim to live in a rule-based world?
The choice, as Jeffrey Sachs framed it for the UN, is law or anarchy, and the world is waiting for the answer.